Hi, I'm Demi Stevens, founder and CEO of You're the Book Press and editor-in-chief of Self-Pub Magazine. I am here in the studio today with author Susan Gourley, writing as Susan Kelley. Welcome.
Thanks for having me here today.
How did you get into writing, and was the pen name first or the real name first?
Well, I like most writers, I've always been a reader, from elementary school on, and I could never get enough to read. And I grew up way out in the country, so we didn't have a community library.
No library?
It was, just what books we would have at school.
Oh,
and,
wow.
I was lucky I had an aunt who was also a reader, but she read all romances. So I started.
So you grew up on romance?
I did start reading those because there was nothing else to read when school was not in session. And then I didn't really think about writing. I was busy teaching school and having my kids.
Oh, where do you teach?
I was a teacher at Lower Dolphin. I left after 34 years to be a full-time writer.
You don't look old enough to retire.
Well, thank you, but I am.
Oh.
And of course, when you're very busy, you're teaching, you're coaching, your kids are little, they're involved. But about the time I had my fourth child, I started to write some things out longhand when I had time, and then I eventually put them on the computer, went to my first, and my first book was a romance, and I went to, my first writers conference, and
oh, those are intimidating, aren't they?
Oh, and I was lucky I had joined the local chapter of RWA, so I had two veterans who went with me, one a published author. So they kind of showed me the ropes, but it was so intimidating to speak to an editor for the first time. Mm-hmm. And I learned that...
Were they doing book pitches at Romance Writers?
They were,
yeah.
And I learned that I did not know anything about writing, and even though I could tell good stories, they were nowhere close to publishable. So it took a number of years after that. I took classes and attended more conferences, and then I did find a publisher for my romances. But in the meantime, in the back of my head, I was reading a lot of epic fantasy. And of course, like most writers, I loved Lord of the Rings. I read it first in 8th or 9th grade and went through...
It read a lot differently back then. I did that too, and now I read it with modern... I didn't think it read like that, but
that's true.
Publishing changes over the years.
Yes, and then after being a writer, I read that book even differently, and I'm amazed at certain things, like that he invented his own language for that book, but his background was in linguistics.
Yeah, it transfers, but Tolkien also essentially established a genre.
He did, and it was amazing. And he also, he was very much a perfectionist, and it took him a long time to get published, so that's encouraging for writers. That, it took him a while, and he did pretty well. So while I was writing romances, and I was published in those, and they were doing okay, I started to write my fantasy books. And I did find publishers for those, and that's been a frustrating struggle. It's very difficult to break into that genre. So
there are fewer publishers, I think, covering fantasy.
There are fewer, and they have some big names that they really promote and buy, but they only really break out a few new authors every year, where they give them the big hardback release and all the promotion. But I was a little discouraged by that, but I kept writing my romance, and as like most writers, I think I got better at it. And then my space opera series just seemed to hit the market at the right time, right about the time that Star Trek, the remake came out, and Chris Pine, and then you had Khan in the second one of those, and my recon Marines, who are genetically engineered to be superior humans, were very much like Khan, except they weren't psychopathic, godlike
And we don't really need a psychopathic protagonist.
So,
or do we? I don't know.
There's a couple ways you could go. I guess if you were like that, you could be a psycho, or you could be someone who is very honorable and dutiful. But I think just the market was ready for that. So they've done really well, and it really enthused me to give more to my the romance genre with my writing.
So you started out in romance under a pseudonym. Was there a reason behind that?
Oh, well, as I said, I was
teaching?
A high school teacher, and I had a great relationship with my students, and that's what I miss that about teaching. But, you don't want them reading romance. Even though my romances weren't.
Is it not a pot boiler?
Yeah, it's not that they're really hot, steamy romances, with
no spacesuits were burned in the making of this romance.
But they may have been shed a few times. So, I didn't want my students. Well, I didn't really talk about my writing with my students. But once I was published in epic fantasy, well, then my students heard of me. And
so what made you choose to go that route with your real name then?
Well, at that time, a lot of people felt that you needed to separate. If you were writing in two different genres,
you had two different brands,
two different names.
Okay.
And now, that goes back and forth. And now there's a lot of people who say, well, maybe you shouldn't do that. And I did it because I wanted to keep my romance from my high school students, basically. And that's why I did it more than for a marketing reason. And now, readers are pretty savvy, and they know that with all the online resources, they're going to find out that Susan Kelley is Susan Gourley, which is what my high school students eventually did. But, so I don't think it's as big a deal now as it was at one time. They know I'm the same person. So, even if a person isn't a fan of elves,
one genre,
but they've liked my space opera, they may try that just because they like my writing.
How do you deal with this out in public? I mean, your friends come up to you and say, oh my God, I didn't know that you wrote this too.
Yes, it kind of, especially when this one book became a bestseller, and my husband has never ceased to brag about how my writing is doing.
Big shout out. What's his name?
Ronald.
Ronald, way to go. Ultimate husband move.
Yes, he is. And he claims he's actually the blueprint for the hero and all that. And once he found out, the school administrators knew, the principals knew, and it's kind of snowballed from there. So when I see the people I used to teach with, they always ask me how my writing's going. They know that's what I'm doing.
Well, you've built an empire.
Well, it is nice to have the support of those people. I don't know if they buy my books, but they're supportive of what I do. So
that's most important. No, buying books is important. Never kid yourselves, readers. Buy books. Support your friends in their writing addiction, because you could be next. Do you have any words of advice or ideas for our viewers who may be sitting out there on a story of their own?
If you have a story, write it down, and maybe you won't try to publish it this year, but I have so many writing friends who wrote a book or wrote a short story and put it away for years.
Try decades.
And then pull it out. It may be a decade later, and they have learned something about the business or about writing, or maybe they have the time. Like, I didn't have the time when my kids were little. And they have the time, and they develop it into a book, and they learn more. And, that story may have been a story that they've had in their mind since they were a teenager. And, the first book I wrote, I think I thought about that story for 2 or 3 years before I finally put it to paper. So, if not now, maybe later. So, I think everyone can do it. It just takes time and work and perseverance.
Absolutely. That's great advice. You can do this too. Thanks so much, Susan, for joining us today.
Thank you.